Okay, welcome. Welcome to the final lecture of the semester. A semester of amazing lectures, and one that I'm sure this will fit right in there with those we've had thus far. I'm really pleased to welcome Lydia Kallipoliti to the School of Architecture. Lydia is an architect, engineer, and scholar whose research is situated at the intersection of architecture, technology, and environmental politics. Currently an assistant professor at the Cooper Union in New York, she's also taught at Rensselaer Polytechnic, Syracuse, Columbia, and Pratt, to name a few. Lydia's work has been published and exhibited widely, including the Venice Biennale, the Istanbul Design Biennial, the Shenzhen Biennial, you're a biennial person, the Onassis Cultural Center, the Royal Academy of British Architects, and the Storefront for Art and Architecture. She's the author of the History of Ecological Design for Oxford English Encyclopedia of Environmental Science, and was the editor. I was also a co-editor of that. Joking. And was the editor of Eco Redux, a special issue of Architectural Design magazine. Lydia's award-winning book, The Architecture of Closed Worlds, or What is the Power of Shit, is a genealogy of contained microcosms, which also contain the ambition to replicate the Earth in its totality. They represent a taxonomy of living experiments that forge a synthetic naturalism, where the laws of nature and metabolism are extracted from the domain of wilderness and reconfigured in the domain of people and their constructed environments. Confronting questions of containment, closure, nature, the collapse of nature, post-nature, humanism and post-humanism, to name a few, closed worlds represent and technologically aspire to confront and facilitate humanity's desire for mastery over nature. They also represent the urgent potential that reimagining humanity's relation to nature and to the earth as the ultimate closed world promises. John Muir said something along the lines of, "Most of us live on the world, not in it." Lydia's work serves as a contemporary reflection and catalog of this challenge, and to me outlines a form of radical interiority which may be instrumental to how we see our future on this planet. Closed worlds engage and provoke us as forms of post-natural, post-human trans-architecture, which are deeply interior, sensorial, and immersive, and are charged by technological processes and natural simulations and metabolism. Closed worlds distill architectural concerns related to habitation, first in an integrated structure where humans, their physiology of ingestion and excretion, become combustion devices tied to the system with umbilical cords. Second, closed worlds are giant stomachs, and as chambers for a different nature, they are also inhabitable machines that digest resources and are sometimes disobedient, challenging and then shifting hierarchies of control from people to environments and back again. Humans may ultimately play only a part in managing these total ecologies, which include living and technological actors that are non-human as well. In this thinking, we're never not inside such notions of closure, and studies such as the one that Lydia has undertaken serve as bellwethers, reference manuals, and calls to action. They are indeed provocative and curious cases for us to consider. I'm proud to welcome Lydia Kallipoliti to the School of Architecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me guess. You said it so well that I don't know if I have anything else to say at this point. Thank you so much, Clay, for the invitation. I'm really thrilled to be here, especially because your Dean, Michelle Addington, has contributed an amazing piece at the epilogue of this book, which you should all read if you get the chance, questioning the idea of integration and the idea of the totality of the whole system. So this is something that I'm going to talk about today by showing you a number of living experiments that I've registered and documented, analyzed in this book. So I'm going to talk about this project. And you see here it's a book, but it's a bit more than a book. And I'm going to talk not only about the content of the book, but also about the idea of how to examine historical documents and write nonlinear histories. The book at the beginning, it had this kind of title that is a very normative, canonical architectural title, The Architecture of Closed Worlds, which one can reference The Architecture of Well-Tempered Environments by Rainer Banham, and that sounds fairly good in quotations. The subtitle is something very ugly, or What is the Power of Shit? And I was, at the beginning, I was hesitant to use profanity in the title of my book. But I think it's important to bring this kind of normalization of how we interrogate, examine building technology in the history of architectural production to a very raw material reality of how we contaminate the earth, how we outsource the product of our contamination from cities to other places that are going to areas of environmental poverty, for example, and what that means, how we can use and possibly imagine, speculate on different ways to handle resources in both imaginative ways for designers, but also in ways that can help this poor, poor planet. So, closed world. I'm not the person that invented the title. Obviously, there was a historian of science from Michigan, Paul Edwards, who wrote a book on closed worlds. He coined the term, and he was giving a revisionist account of computing in Cold War America, understanding the idea of the closed world as a kind of feedback loop where information feeds in itself and creates new kind of subsystems of new information. So he writes at some point, a closed world is radically divided against itself, turned inexorably inward, without frontiers or escape. A closed world threatens to annihilate itself, to implode from the inside. So he offers this account of computing and the idea of feedback as a kind of circular form of reasoning, whereas in my book, I'm trying to outline a genealogy of contained microcosms with the idea, as Clay mentioned, the ambition to replicate the Earth in its totality. I'm registering a series of living experiments that forge a synthetic type of naturalism that is displaced from the domain of wilderness, which was what, let's say, 19th century naturalists that were going to the field were doing. It's displacing wilderness to the laboratory and then to the domain of cities and buildings. So the idea of a world in a bottle is nothing new to architects. And here you see a kind of art piece by Hausrucker Co., the Austrian underground Viennese group. This is called Ein Stück Natur, a piece of nature. It was exhibited in an art fair in Cologne, but it's very important because it's a very interesting representation of a rural, almost like a primitive hut coming out of Logier. It's important because by the time that these kinds of images appear as art installations, they really display our idea of loss of the untamed land, of a savage wild territory that we no longer have to our availability, and we need to enclose and recreate using technological instrumentality. So also the idea of the closed world is absolutely tied to the history of utopia, and this is something that everybody knows. It is Buckminster Fuller's dome over Manhattan in 1960 by Fuller and his Cornell student Soji Sadao, where the people inside the bubble can breathe safely. It's an unpolluted environment protected by the dirty urbanity that where resources can be handled in a different way. So these examples are iconic illustrations of a period of intense environmental anxiety. And like jarred fossils, they represent the idea of the lost land, of the lost wilderness that we need to safeguard and recreate. In many ways, closed world is very close to our canonical understanding of utopia, which is close to the idealization of the world as a closed system. What is a utopia? And this is Claude Nicolas Ledoux's Royal Salt Works, of course. It is a physical environment that is demarcated in a very clear way from its surroundings. You see the circle here. and all the flow of resources, trade, the practice of daily life does not allow for the transfer of matter and energy outside of borders. Everything happens inside. New subsystems are born from the systems at play. In the post-war period, nevertheless, this idea of delineation of a perimeter of circularity is revived and reappears in the enactment of whole Earth systems that became super popularized with the Whole Earth Catalog and the view of the Earth. The recirculation of resources in the global ecosystem was idealized in the idea of circularity and containment, and a number of projects have proliferated, both military projects or governmental projects, as well as countercultural projects, kind of antithetical political agendas, which at the same time express a very similar form of reasoning. In this sense, closed worlds are not only key sites of engineering and environmental production, but they also materialize a utopian project to temper and fabricate the environment as a site of architectural production. But, and this is not a real, place, it is from Jacques Tati's Playtime movie, which is, let's say, a canonical architectural movie that everybody should see. But it does represent a situation which makes us think that closed worlds are no longer poetic metaphors for lost utopias, but they have become profitably real. Our indoor environments today are, in fact, politically charged spaces that reflect social ideas and culturally specific standards of taste and judgment. Confined within artificial enclosures, environmental control has enforced biased standards of life, even though in most cases these standards institutionalize absurd criteria that homogenize the idea of comfort and well-being for everybody, for the entirety of the human race. And this, I wanted to show this. This is like the comfort zone, and I can't really explain it in front of Michelle. I'm afraid of making a mistake here, but it's true. I know that this is the regular temperature, the dry temperature, and there's like wet bulb temperature and all of that. But what's interesting is that this very, very small region identifies what comfort means for everybody, whereas in reality, it influenced by a number of different factors, like the metabolic rate of a human being, the clothing, the flow of air, the speed of air, pressure of air, levels of humidity, a number of different factors. In many ways, the establishment of these kinds of conditions and the fact that they've been institutionalized in HVAC systems and manifest in most of corporate office environments brings us to a point that in some ways closed worlds are power structures that maintain and manage constancy over bodies and psyches. The establishment of thermal equilibriums in interior spaces since the 1940s and 50s, sequestered comfort zones held within narrow ranges reflects an understanding of the body as a tool within a constant atmospheric medium in order to control and predict its behavior and growth. It is precisely this mechanical vision of the body and of biology that gives life specifically a modern character. If organisms, either people or plants, are examined explicitly as mechanical structures, the human body as an engine of combustion, which is something that most building technology manuals portray, then one cannot account for the complexity, but neither for the beauty of life. So I argue that the history of 20th century architecture, design, and engineering has been strongly linked to the conceptualization and production of closed systems and the manufacturing of what Clay called an interiority, the idea of interiority. As partial reconstructions of the world in time and in space, closed systems speak of the eerie transference of life using architecture as a medium and a vessel to secure the cycling of matter, energy, data, and capital. The projects that are documented in the book are entirely different in terms of their program, but also in terms of their political agendas. They range from military experiments to countercultural practices, to the nostalgia of the homesteading movement, to more recently the dubious concept of ecological tourism and environmental capitalism. In every case, these systems are real and they're invested in the strangeness of the real. They're not speculations, they're not experimental drawing problems, they're implemented rather than based upon speculation. So with this range of materials, with this range of approaches, the question that I had was, how does one write this nonlinear history? Rather than a linear text, in the book I examine, redesign, and reimagine an archive. An archive which I see not as a static object that contains historical documents, but as an immersive space and a living collection where existential ideas about world orders migrate through different architectural and spatial typologies. Contrary to a linear text, a reconfigured archive allows multiplicity, simultaneity, and disruption. It allows the reader to travel between different times, places, and objects of investigation, enabling different and multiple connections and complex affinities between themes, concepts, and ideas that are not limited to a single place, author, era, and style. A reconfigured archive can produce new interconnected categories out of archival boxes that we find. A universe of multitudes that does not necessarily need to be transcribed in linear time. I see the use of history absolutely as a creative and generative medium for contemporary concerns in design, education, and practice. One that does not only promote public engagement with historical material, but also makes evident that in the history of ideas, discourses get recycled. Materials are not the only things in closed worlds that are recycled. So concepts emerge as allegedly new, but ideas undergo long journeys of migration from one epistemological field to another. Contrary to a building, a drawing, or a book, the archive and the database is a distinctive disciplinary category of an architectural object that empowers new forms of authorship, based on the extrusion of evidence to an event that lingers between reality and fiction. And this is my cheesy slide. It is an example that I use to conceptualize time, to write books, and to write histories, as in the history of large-scale galaxies. As far as we know, when we see a distant galaxy, we see it as it was when light has left it, not as it is today. Our understanding, therefore, of the universe is perplexing and partial at best, since the only thing we have is a form of time machine, one that allows us to see the past through investigation, observation, and monitoring. Some people doubt whether we can ever know what the universe was like billions of years ago. Actually, the real problem is knowing what it is like right now. I find this cosmological metaphor empowering because it implies the end of history as a knowledge of the present looking into the past. It offers an alternative reading of history as a reconstruction project of what can be selectively illuminated out of, let's say, an archive of objects and materials in order to fabricate multiple versions of present states based on fragments of the past. But in order to go a little bit deeper into the material of the book and the Closed Worlds projects, I will talk about 3 specific projects, and then we can reconvene with these kinds of deeper questions. And I will start by the most famous one, because when you reference the idea of a closed worlds, everybody thinks of Biosphere 2 in Oracle, Arizona, which was built in 1991. And I will talk about, in every project, I have a series of statements, manifesto statements, conclusions. But you probably, most of you know this, This place, Biosphere 2, remains the largest and most famous closed ecological system ever built. Its purpose was to test the viability of a biologically regenerative artificial environment to support human habitation in space and to provide a prototype Earth colony in case the Earth would fail. It was built by a company that was self-proclaimed Space Biospheres venture that was assembled by a financier who gave the money, originally $200 million, whose name was Ed Bass, and an ecosystems biologist and thinker named John Allen, an environmentalist. Biosphere 2 supported 2 missions. This is the first crew that entered the facility in 1991, and they stayed for 2 years and 20 minutes. The team produced their own food and air supply within a heavily sequestered series of ecosystems. During the entire experiment, all of the crew's waste, including waste from their domesticated animals, was recycled by natural, low-tech filtration methods. Why am I showing you this? You will see. Biosphere 2 is famous because, most of all, it failed spectacularly and very publicly. The first mission became notorious for technical and operational failures, especially for not creating enough oxygen. It was said that they had to pump oxygen in the facility. After 6 months, oxygen absorption, that's one theory, was still curing. Concrete, as it cures, absorbs oxygen, and the levels of oxygen fell by 6%, which is dramatic for the well-being of the there are other theories that the soil was absorbing, soil as it was curing was absorbing oxygen and so forth. But there was another incident, and this is why this, really weird ant is on the screen. Along with very poor interior air quality, unanticipated species like cockroaches and this ant, crazy ants, thrived. There were species that were regressive. They were from hundreds of years ago, and they somehow appeared in that facility. So a lot of the feedback loops in the mathematical diagrams and the simulations went completely off, went south, basically, and all of these weird things appeared. Also, the biospherians suffered from hunger throughout the 2 years of their residency. This is one person that lost 13% of his body mass. Was notorious because of mutiny and public feuds among different stakeholders involved in the facility's management. There's a very interesting story here. In time, this guy, John Allen, who was, let's say, the philosopher-scientist, they called him, he was the ecologist that had the idea about this world, started arguing very intently with the businessman, Ed Bass. His group that were called the synergists were allegedly destroying the credibility of the project, according to the guy that was giving the money, Bass. And he took action in hiring the now controversial white nationalist Stephen Bannon to run Space Biospheres Ventures. The involvement of Bannon in that facility, who was at the time manager of Bannon & Co. Investment banking in Beverly Hills, was detrimental to the project. With Bass and Bannon's endorsement, the second team of biospherians who entered the facility in 1994 were ambushed by federal marshals. The two men concluding that the founding team, the synergist and Allen, they had a cult and they had to be evacuated, entirely detached from the project. In retaliation, the synergists and Allen, the scientists, sabotaged the second experiment. They opened the airlocks, compromised the experiment, claiming concern over the health of the inhabitants, and then they were arrested. The mission was compromised, and it finished a little bit after that. Bannon also had an open quarrel with biospherian Abigail Ayling, who was an oceanographer, and she was responsible to document the ecosystem of the ocean. And their corals were originally published in the Tucson Citizen in 1996 and resurfaced in the media during the presidential elections of 2016, disclosing a series of harassments, threats, accusations of sexual abuse. Now, it's important to see that the material problems of the first mission were rendered as social and political problems in the second and final human mission. Both events revealed that the idea of dynamic equilibrium of material exchange in an arbitrarily chosen part of the Earth's biosphere cannot just set in spontaneously. Redundancy of species and the logic of inclusiveness did not automatically lead to the cybernetic equilibrium that Allen, the philosopher-scientist, so earnestly desired. The battle between Allen and Bass exposes an important dichotomy in environmental politics, that between the idealization of self-organization and the brutality of Darwinian evolution, which was transposed to social order and policy. In many ways, Biosphere 2 exhibits a mythology of a consensus based on natural principles and furthers the belief that equilibrium should be translated to social policy and societal values. As a living experiment, Biosphere 2 demonstrates that the limits of sustainability and the risks associated with closed ecosystems remain largely unknown. The other statement that one can derive from these events is that closed worlds are a form of hysteria. After years of research on self-reliance, of advocating on self-reliance, the creator of the Whole Earth Catalog, Stuart Brand, confessed that the idea of energy autonomy was a kind of hysteria. And Brand's kinship between the closed system and the hysteric body is critical if we reflect on Freud's definition of hysteria as a physiological internal modification of the nervous system. To describe the symptoms of hysteria, Freud spoke of closure as a type of modification that affects an organism alone instead of one that affects an organism and his or her surroundings. Psychoanalytically, this corresponds to a stage of development called the Proto Psyche, at which an organism has control over nothing except for itself. Ultimately, it functions like an ad hoc system that regenerates materials out of what is available within the borders of its own body. Another conclusion is that closed worlds do not imply that the Earth wants to be held in our hands. We are not its caretakers. The idea of fabricating a replication of the Earth in a smaller section has fostered a perception of circularity and thus a perception of Earth holding. These are some images from the past 10 years, a progeny of Earth photographs that are held gently and affectionately by human hands as if the Earth is a wounded baby that needs our care. It is, in fact, an anthropomorphic perception of the Earth as an endangered living species that is cute and sentient, as a being that needs to be petted by us, its conquerors, which is absolutely delusional and colonial as it positions our species at the center of planetary developments when in fact we have no idea what to do. Our perception of the Earth as one interconnected world, as an image that promotes unity and balance, is no longer the case. Unilateral strategies for divergent problems in the ideological belief that the metabolism of the planet may become the foundation for technology, culture, and design is no longer applicable. The Whole Earth Catalog is not so whole anymore, or never was so whole to begin with. So from that colossal project of massive venture capital, I'm going to pass on to a countercultural project in a city using minimal resources, the Integral Urban House in 1974. And it was a project by an underground community group called the Farallones Institute that was headed by the pioneer of sustainable architecture, who was also state architect of California at the time, Sim Vanderen. The project was initiated by Helga and William Olkowski and was funded by the Farallones Institute. It was a domestic organization in an urban setting envisioned by its founders as a healthy, natural, cyclical ecosystem. And you see their diagram, which is a kind of a representation of the naivete of this totality and circularity of the 70s homesteading movement, where all abundant resources can create a complete regenerative energy economy for the house. It was a typical house in Berkeley, California that was retrofitted by the Farallones Institute to a highly productive test bed for self-reliance, resource renewal, and recycling of waste materials. What was mostly interesting was that the house was tied with its inhabitants with a kind of umbilical cord. It needed constant maintenance, and the dwellers were linked to the house in a very corporeal way. The ecosystem of the house was linked to the community of its stakeholders, and they all had to rehearse the protocols of habitation and make several announcements that they would abide to these protocols of taking out the mulch, of cleaning this, of taking that material out to feed the engines, and so forth. So it was an ecosystem that had a domino effect where small actions or the lack thereof would have a larger effect to the health of the house overall. According to its founders, it was significant to repeatedly explain the action plan of life to all members and commit to specific behavioral protocols before inhabiting the house. So this format of habitation brings me to the idea that in many ways the occupant of a closed world is its own guinea pig. This is what Buckminster Fuller called himself in an essay that he wrote, which was Guinea Pig B, B for Bucky. And a guinea pig in many ways does not observe and speculate on possible outcomes. Rather, it is willful to insert its bodily parts into a living experiment. The closed world dweller is therefore its feeder and caretaker. He or she monitors it closely and safeguards its operation. And here are some examples. This is the French balloonist Auguste Piccard in 1978. That was the first person to reach the stratosphere in a hermetically sealed aluminum gondola, almost reaching his death. It was fortuitous that he survived after he was shot to the stratosphere. This is the Russian scientist Evgeny Shepelev, that was the first human to remain in a closed ecosystem containing only chlorella, which is a type of algae, as the only bioregenerative component. That was the Russian experiment Biosphere. It started in 1972, and he was eating only this type of protein for 90 days and survived. And this is a diagram of a British architect called Graham Kane. This is him, where he portrays himself as part of a system of interdependencies or codependencies. His excrements, his human excrements, becoming extraordinarily important to feeding the digesters that will then produce methane and so forth in a series of relationships. So without him being part of this system, the biotechnical systems of the house would degenerate and die. And in reality, when he left the house became sick and all the systems failed. The interesting thing is that while ecological systems of the post-war period portray the inhabitant, the physics of the body, as an indispensable part of a building ecology, currently this image is a disenfranchised narrative. Environmental concerns promote mostly a conservationist ethic and a list of cautionary daily practices of scarcity for daily life. Don't have long showers, don't use this. And yet there is nothing more visceral as a participatory spatial experience than the scientists and the occupants voluntary containment within the premises of a closed world, and the understanding that it's not just statistic of the building as an object, but it is also our presence and our effect on the spaces that we occupy that really changes the entire picture. Going back to the integral urban house, humans are not central here. There are other, plants and animals are much more central. So they have a nominal role within a larger series of ecosystems. And the ambition overall was not to change the system holistically, but to reorient waste as a productive byproduct that fosters different pathways or more possibilities for each cycle of resources. Food production yielded from the management of organic and inorganic waste was key to the integral urban house, as well as to several other domestic experiments at the time that heralded the idea of self-reliance from the grid of supplies. So they tried to make food from human excrements, and the way to do that was a series of tedious, repetitive, dirty daily tasks like sorting, composting, mixing mulch with vegetation, feeding animal crops, and so forth. But the idea of the subtle fluctuation of living substances and material phase changes made the group look into research that was not countercultural, but it was really conducted by major industrial stakeholders at the time, like General Electric. In General Electric, they researched thermophilic bacteria that had the potential to create protein from the waste of livestock, and in forming bacteria soups, which could be broken down in cellulosic waste and then into protein for animal feed. This was an ongoing effort to chemically engineer bacteria that would perform efficient tasks while eating toxins found in petroleum. Specifically, this guy, who was an Indian microbiologist working for General Electric, Ananda Chakrabarty, developed a man-made living organism which combined features of several strains of Pseudomonas bacteria that would eat toxins found in petroleum. He attempted to patent the bacteria, and the patent office rejection led to a very famous United States Supreme Court case known as Diamond versus Chakrabarty on whether genetically modified organisms could be patented. The court ruled in the scientist's favor, stating that even if bacteria is alive, it is without any legal significance for the purposes of the patent law. But this court case did raise ethical questions as to where life begins and what are the ethics involved in pre-engineering the autonomy of microorganisms. It also silently introduced into the field of designing and building a field of semi-autonomy or disobedience of matter. Now it is a fact that we can recirculate these types of resources and that we're not so delusional after all. Nevertheless, with the introduction of these questions into the field of architecture and design, one inevitably accepts that if ecological houses are in fact digestive machines, there's sometimes disobedience, and this is what autonomy means in many respects. So to write a counter-history in circular material economies, one needs to look at shit. One needs to look at excrement, because only through this raw confrontation may the ecology of life be somehow useful. Shit forces us to look at questions of ecology viscerally via the raw ecology of our bodies and the understanding that recycling is not just a statistical problem relayed to the management of urban resources, but a basic bodily reality affecting the air and the water we breathe. And this is something that gives the transportation of human excrements a different kind of dimension. This is called a poop train, and it transfers human excrements from New York to Alabama because New York creates so much poo that there's nowhere to put it. So with this train, which creates stink methane clouds along its way, famously known in the industry as biosolids, It travels to a landfill in West Birmingham, causing what the locals call a death smell. So all of this material is exported out of the metropolis to an area of the impoverished, which is in fact a case of environmental racism. And it is something to really think about, not just in terms of what can shit generate, but really if there are other ways to avoid this kinds of massive transportation happening. So have I been speaking for an hour? Because I'll skip this example if I have.
We have 6 o'clock classes, that's why there's so many.
Oh, okay. I just want to make sure I don't exhaust the audience. Because I have one more thing to show and then concluding. The last example I wanted to speak is Epcot and the architecture of compulsive happiness. And this was the dream of Walt Disney, a project called the Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow, which was a controlled, sanitized, and protected circular city, providing not only a new theme park of entertainment and leisure, but also new living patterns for happy dwellers. Disney really believed that he could design happiness by using technology, and more specifically, that if he would regulate pollution, trash, ventilation, electricity to offer leisure, he would create a community of happy dwellers. And this is an audience possessed by the power of Mickey Mouse, according to Mickey. But it's indicative because he truly believed in the idea of uncomplicated, wholesome entertainment inside his own pre-engineered fantasy, an idea which was as much a closed world as the physical reality of the city that he conceptualized for Disneyland. Epcot was critiqued. This is the plan for subsuming the history of Utopia, from Claude Nicolas Ledoux to the Garden City of Ebenezer Howard, to the American City Beautiful movement of the 1890s, to Victor Gruen's urban models, along with the added benefits of improving air quality and weather comfort. It was a living laboratory and a technology showroom for future cities, just at the time when cities around the world were decaying and disintegrating. In Epcot, each house had its own fuels and was connected to a centralized waste collection system, water supply, and living farm, using swamplands and filtering plants. It was also connected via through the center and tying all parts of the property. But most importantly, the city center was meant to be enclosed in a climatically controlled dome, which was literally copy-pasted from Buckminster Fuller's dome over Manhattan. Disney has largely been critiqued by architectural and cultural critics for his earnest belief in controlling human emotions through the sovereignty of territory and in the pursuit of happiness as a game of managing comfort and human physiology. And this is one of the critiques by the British cybernetician and architect Royston Landau, who was teaching at the AA about urban complexity in cities. And he analyzed Mickey Mouse as the great dictator, really bringing the kind of contradiction of urban decay versus the idealization of this type of environment that would be a laboratory living. And Disney was very big on, astronauts and which really brings to the forefront the perception of life as a feedback loop of input and output, as the process of combustion and oxidation, which was widespread in the design of the space, but as a life support system, and in the understanding of trauma following the war. Here is Mickey Mouse as an astronaut as well. So this was a feedback diagram for an astronaut. It's about communication resources, but I'm gonna speak about something different. The understanding of trauma following the war through the words of Jewish psychiatrist and neurologist Viktor Frankl in his best-selling book Man's Search for Meaning, that was written after his stay at a Nazi concentration camp. And he argued that the difference between those who had lived and those who had died came down to one thing: their ability to find meaning in the most trivial, repetitive, and mechanical tasks of life. In his own words, happiness could not be pursued, it must ensue, and could in fact ensue from the meaning of sustaining life through a series of problem-solving challenges. And speaking of problem-solving, the biggest accomplishment, according to critics of Disneyland, was not the design of the utopic city, but the invention of utilidors, which were these underground channels. They were very much a problem-solving solution containing a series of systems to handle waste that the park produced in an entirely circular closed system. They would be underground and shot from above, which is a very similar system to the one that Roosevelt Island in New York has implemented with pneumatic tubes. So these are the kind of diagrams that were published for Epcot, and they do reveal what I call the problem of the arrow, the idealization of circularity, which speaks to a deeply rooted problem of deduction in environmental representation, which is visualized almost exclusively with the use of arrows. Since the 1960s, ecologist Howard Odom's energy systems language has instrumentalized ecosystems as well as human agency in terms of input and output. This representational language of ecological simulation models, derivative from electronic circuits, has become the primary tool for architects to visualize performance and energy flow. Arrows, though, however legible, remove a type of drawing agency that is critical to our field. Could alternative notation systems and fields effectively replace arrows, given that arrows point only to the end goal of conversions, but say very little about the process of recycling itself? The Chilean biologist Francisco Varela argued that cognitive systems cannot be understood explicitly on the basis of their input and output relationships, but on the basis of their operational closure. Thus, the language of environmental representation represents a process of interlinked threads, while these threads and processes are trying to develop a relationship with themselves. In the environment, perception is seen as a cognitive process of hypothesis formation, not as a simple prescription or reflection of pre-given information. So a closed world, along with its dwellers, is a new type of unbalanced ecosystemic model, susceptible to the shortcomings of digestion. What remains a paradox is how this model, this questionable model, imbued with the vitalism of a digestive stomach, has become the mainstream model of what we now call a net zero habitat opposing energy loss. So again, how does one write this nonlinear history? And what is this? Can one medium be sufficient to tell a story like that? In many ways, in this project, my intention was not to investigate all of these diverse materials in one way, but through different mediums, by writing a book, an exhibition, an online lexicon, a website, and a number of courses. This is the exhibition of closed worlds in New York City at the Storefront for Art and Architecture. It was done in 2016, where information about each closed world was inhabited by a person putting its head on, but then there was a timeline and materials that somebody could take home. This is another image, but also through a virtual reality installation that would bring the visitors inside all of this information, inside the spaces and the occupation of these types of experiments. This is another iteration of the exhibition in Los Angeles in 2019. You see the kind of leaflets are a kind of partial book that could be assembled by taking a leaflet for each type of project. And the final version of the iteration of the exhibition in Sydney, Australia, this past summer in 2019, that was added. We added these kinds of spaces, these kind of human figures that inhabited closed worlds, and a new kind of virtual reality component. And there was also in the book, there is also this kind of history that I call minor history of closed worlds, which is the unbuilt version, the experiments that were iconic in architectural history and production, but were not realized. You see one here, the environmental bubble by Rainer Banham, the Arctic city of Fry Otto, Haus Rucker Co., this kind of jar that I showed before, and the dome over Manhattan, of course. And this is the Closed Worlds Lexicon, where you can go online. Some information is available that creates in a very linear and straightforward format all of these kinds of technical words that I have encountered doing my research, and the way that they can apply to architectural design. So while working on any project that I write about, I'm compelled to pursue different modes of research, including historical archival surveys, combined with technical reports and data management, investigations on alternative formats of representations, lexicons, and databases. Diversity is critical to my work, not only in the analysis of each project's content, but also in the forms of dissemination and display. In closed worlds, I have been largely motivated to pursue different modes of research, technical reports, archival surveys, net zero diagrams, toward the productions of different mediums of display. And the question is not only how do we write a story based on the material that we found, but how do we inhabit information and knowledge? How do we immerse ourselves into an environment that this material can become something more than something to look at from a distance? A tentative term that I use to describe my research in a broader context is the use of history machines and mediums of immersive scholarship. In many projects, I examine, redesign, and reimagine archives. I see archives sometimes as figments of past, sometimes as figments of future, but definitely as immersive spaces and living collections where existential ideas travel in time and they can be displayed in different formats. So the question I would like to leave with you today is whether this is a deviant story of architectural history. And I believe it is not. In many ways, there was a critique by Mimi Zeiger, who wrote about this book, that a closed world is like a death wish of the design object. And it is true that some projects represent feats of science, engineering, and technology, with architecture merely taking a part. However, architecture is not replaced altogether with science and engineering. It is displaced from a field that shapes the use and form of the physical world to a sensorial immersive environment that copies and simulates the metabolism and experiential aptitudes of the natural world. So far, the role of building technology has been to insulate spaces from environmental flows. This method suggests in many ways a moral discipline that protects buildings against disease, transferring an ideological framework of Protestant theology and ethics to the microrealm of materials. Nevertheless, in a new reality that is inundated with sudden climatic changes, methane gas clouds, oceanic islands of decomposed debris, a new role is cast to the notion of environment. Instead of it being the inactive, static, and historicized context of an architectural object, the environment quite literally becomes the object of design itself. It is also not a deviant story because closed worlds reflect the modern human subject, which is immersed in a carefully curated replication or reverberation of the world as a pre-engineered fantasy. Inside the unimaginable amount of bits and pieces of information that we encounter daily in our lives, the only way to navigate this reality is relative to oneself, or as French philosopher Quentin Meillassoux has put it, interrelational loss with context. Our need for embeddedness in the world and the ecosystem might already be obsolete. In psychoanalysis, this closure corresponds to the stage of the Proto Psyche, denying any environmental input as well as discharging output. In some ways, in this stage, the subject becomes its own self-referential reality. In this new way, we are in dire need of a new kind of criticism, of new ways to fathom with interiorization, and methods to break barriers in the way that we narrate stories through the design of our environments as well as the shaping of our reality. If every bit of fact is designed in the world of post-truth, the role of the architect, albeit unwittingly, has expanded to more than shaping the physical world and the aesthetic and experiential aptitudes of our daily existence. In many ways, it has become of civilizational value. So we need to investigate, monitor, and document the strangeness of the real, to invent an architecture completely devoted to the problems of the real, but not one that is unaware of its uncertainty and complexity. Shit engulfs our existence in more ways than we want to observe and acknowledge. It is not about constructing fictions and fantasies, but about closely observing, conducting forensic analyses, asking questions, and instrumentalizing our findings in a creative way. Possibly shit is our only way out. Thank you. Do I sit here or?
Sure.
I don't know what.
We've had so many different ways that this has gone down.
Okay.
So. Any questions?
What is this research exposed in relation to your own fears about what you think is going to happen in your life?
Oh. It's not a fear. It is a documentation of the construction of a global interior, basically. I'm witnessing a kind of movement when we have places like, you know, gigantic malls in China that have their own oceans, you know, malls in America that recreate their own climates. We have the ski center in Dubai. We also have the Eden Project in England that has become a massive asset to the local economy in Cornwall. I don't know if you know the Eden Project by Grimshaw Architects. And also, not only that, but when you see the new headquarters of Google and Apple and Amazon especially, that created jungles like biospheres in the middle of downtown Seattle to augment the productivity of their workers, it begs the question of what is this interiority and how can we fathom, understand it, but also break barriers, because it is something that is detrimental, I think. So it's a critique. The book is a critique, but it is a critique of the fact that in order to conserve energy through the kind of oil crisis, there was a movement to construct these insulated locales and to recreate, to like copy biomes of the whole earth in different locations, which is the ski center in Dubai. And it is a kind of hubris to transfer whole climatic regions, like to ski in Dubai. it's not a fear. I'm not. I mean, yes, we're all gonna die. So what? Why should we fear? The fact that we're, going to pass. But I think it's something interesting that this kind of thinking and acting has become a major capital asset and revenue source. This kind of construction, these types of manufactured wilderness and these types of systems are not just to ameliorate living conditions, but are creating these kinds of environments. So the utopia is like manifesting, and that is a little scary. So it's just for us to document it and see it. Do you know forensic architecture, the group?
No.
You should check. I mean, they're doing very, very different work, but their work is really like revealing a reality of what happened in an instance, and I have a lot of respect for what they do. They are trying to, let's say, go back in time and recreate a scene where a crime has taken place in a zone of conflict and see actually what happened using different narrations, media, camera spots, and so forth. And they're just making visible things that are not visible. So I don't know, this is not the same thing, but I think I'm trying to show that this idea of interiorization is manifesting itself in different ways, and especially recently with the corporate world, which has moved towards this direction, it's becoming even more pertinent. You're welcome.
Thank you, Lydia.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. Thank you.